Hi everyone! So I thought that I would do a sort of silly fun video with the Modern Renaissance palette because I'm really ready to tear it apart. As I talked about in, I think it was the palette bingo, I've been wanting to make some Franken shadows out of this palette, but I wanted to use it as is for a little bit, but the time has come. I need change, and what better way than by tearing up eyeshadows and making new ones. However, that is not this video. In this video, I am ranking all of the shadows inside the classic Modern Renaissance palette. I am going from my favorite shadows to my least favorite shadows, and I thought that I would just talk a little bit about each shadow and what I like and what I don't like, and talk about the things that I'm wanting to change, or the things that I plan on altering to make the shadows work for me and to give me a little bit of variety and just some much needed sort of play. I haven't played with makeup a lot over the last week, 2 weeks probably. It's just hasn't been the time for it, and I'm gonna make it the time. So let's talk about the shadows in the palette as it still stands now. So my favorite shadow in the whole palette is Primavera. Primavera is a peachy gold. It's a very warm shadow and it has a beautiful metallic finish. I love the Anastasia metallic formula. I despise the mattes, so I've talked about this a lot. I just find that the mattes are powdery, so you'll notice those are at the bottom of the list and the few metallic shades are at the top of the list because I find them so easy to use. Yes, I do foil them, so I use them wet, generally with Fix Plus. Fix Plus is my favorite way to foil any metallic eyeshadow, and even the shadows that don't need to be foiled, that are pretty intense on their own just when you pick them up with a brush. I find that Fix Plus intensifies the shadow. It also makes it easier for me to apply, and then I can also play around with sort of wet and dry, whether or not the shadow is actually supposed to be used wet or not. If you just use a little bit, a couple droplets of it, and then you can pick up the dry part of the shadow and use it to blend it out if you're just going for like pure metallic or shimmer, and then you do have a little bit of a contrast in terms of depth with like a single shadow. I don't really do that with lighter shades, but it is nice to have that option if you really want something super simple. And Primavera and Vermeer are two shadows that are really good for that, but of course a gold shadow is going to be my number one. I just mentioned Vermeer, but it is my number 2 shade, and I find it to be a very beautiful champagne, and it looks stunning when it's wet, when it's foiled. I don't find that it's that intense when it's dry. That way I will lightly use it like in the inner corner or as a brow bone highlight. Today I really did a very simple look, and I used Realgar and Vermeer and a little bit of raw Sienna just to keep it simple, because I find that too many shades gets too muddy. But if you have just 1 or 2 shades, they can really stand out and sort of pack a punch. You don't need to put too many things together, as fun as that can be, and just the way that I find this to be the most workable for me. But Vermeer, another metallic shade. It is very light, and for me it's not too far from my skin tone, so it can be a very simple everyday sort of metallic. So wear whatever you like whenever you want to wear it, but if I was really going for something sort of more toned down, subdued if you will, Vermeer is a really good metallic for that. The number 3 shadow may surprise you because it was once my least liked shadow in this palette. It's Antique Bronze. Antique Bronze, the warm reddish brown. See, the thing is, it's not a metallic shadow, but it does have a little bit of a pearlescent finish. So I do tend to use this one foiled because I find that I get the best color payoff that way. And I've just been liking those sort of darker, any sort of undertone of brown, really, as long as it has a little bit of shimmer and sheen to it. I find it so simple and easy for an eye look, and Antique Bronze just became one of those really easy shadows for me to use because it was really easy to just smudge on with some black eyeliner, and I really didn't need to use a whole lot of other shadows, just a little bit of a highlight shade, and I had a very simple, everyday smoky eye with antique bronze. So I just thought that was interesting to note because it used to be my least loved shade in this palette and I really didn't use it that much. I will also always remember the person who told me that it pairs really well with Paper Tiger from ColourPop, which is a mustardy single, and that I think sparked a little bit of a love affair with antique bronze because anything that's sort of described as sort of like grungy I like, and definitely antique bronze can be worn that way. Now, that is it for all of the shadows that have a metallic or pearlescent finish. So we are moving into the mattes. Burnt Orange is my next favorite, my number 4 shade. Burnt Orange is a sort of muted orange brown, another very warm toned shadow. I like Burnt Orange, as you can see. Now, I will say also, just because I haven't hit pan on it doesn't mean I like it, and just because I might have hit a lot of pan on it doesn't mean I like it. This palette has made its rounds through different projects and stuff I've been working on, and sometimes I challenge myself to use things that I don't necessarily love. But Burnt Orange is a really good shade for the crease, and it also pairs really well with Primavera. See, I love those shadows in this palette that lean more towards the orange side. I love orange shadows. As I mentioned, I'm wearing Realgar on my eye right now. Because I have blue eyes, the orange really helps contrast it, and I love a classic pairing of a gold eyeshadow and an orange. So something simple, metallic, and then orange in the crease. So for me, it could be Burnt Orange, which is that orangey brown shade, Realgar, which is a little bit more of an intense orange, although it's definitely not very intense anymore, and I had to kind of layer this as well. It's more muted now than it used to be. But even shades like Raw Sienna and Golden Ochre as well pair really well with gold eyeshadows and bring out different tones to the gold, and that's why I really gravitate more towards those kind of shadows when I'm pairing things together. When I was ranking everything as well, I was looking at sort of how I use things within the palette, what I think of the general formulation and shade, and how often I've actually used it, which is why some shades at the bottom are some things that I'm coming around to more, but I just felt like it wouldn't be right to rank them up too high. My 5th favorite shade is Raw Sienna. I don't have pan on Raw Sienna. It is very similar to Burnt Orange, and I would use them almost interchangeably, but I like Raw Sienna because it has slightly less of those orange tones than Burnt Orange, but there's still just like a hint, a whisper of orange in there, so I can play it up a little bit. I find that Raw Sienna is a good shade to bring in if I want to tone down an orange or amp up orange. It kind of will play either way depending on what else I pair with it. I just feel like you can make it a little bit more sort of golden, and sort of you can even pull up more of the brown. I find it's very versatile, and it's also just a very simple shadow. It also looks just great on its own, just a little bit all over the lid with some black eyeliner, and you don't have to go crazy dramatic with this palette. Yes, it's a neutral palette, but there are some colorful, vibrant shades in here as well, and I often see people on Instagram and doing all the crazy dramatic eye looks and, you know, cut creases and double cut creases and layer upon layer, but you can go very simple, and I feel like it's sort of underrated in that way, in the true simplicity, as in a 1 or 2 shadow sort of look. And yes, that is my preference because I find that too much just looks messy, and not in the way that I like it, because oftentimes I'm not doing the very precise makeup. It's not my thing. I don't like it. I like something that looks a little bit more lived in, and I feel like you can really accomplish that with this palette, and I feel like it's not often looked at in that way. My 6th favorite shadow is Love Letter. So Love Letter is one of the shadows that initially drew me to this palette because it is such a beautiful pink shade. Before this palette, I feel like you really didn't see a lot of these sort of shades in palettes, or even in singles. Like, they weren't very accessible, pinks and reds and oranges. This is one of those things that changed, and now they're everywhere and very accessible. And now I've definitely had a lot of other pink shadows I've loved a lot more than Love Letter, but Love Letter is a very beautiful shadow. I am a little tired of it now, and I do find that it is fairly similar to Venetian Red these days just because it has declined in quality. I'm planning it to make a little Franken shadow with Love Letter, show it some different kinds of love, because I feel like with even Red Ochre and Venetian Red, it's too similar, and with the other pinks and stuff I have, I'm never going to use this just purely as a pink. I haven't used it purely on its own for a long time. When I first got the palette, I remember using just like lots of Love Letter and Venetian Red, and you know, really embracing that sort of side of this palette. And so I constantly go back to Love Letter because my eye for the longest time was drawn to this side of the palette. I mean, lately it's been this side, but for many years it was this side of the palette. So I feel like I have to stay true to that with how much I love those sort of wonderful, cooler toned pinks. My seventh favorite shade is Venetian Red. As I said, it's very similar to Love Letter. It's just warmer. Love Letter, it has the subtlest, cooler tones. It's subtly cooler. I feel like in general this is a very, very warm palette, and there's a couple of shadows in here that lean a little bit more towards the cooler side, and they can feel a little awkward when you try to pair them together depending on what sort of arrangement of shadows. But I do think you can put Venetian Red and Love Letter together very easily because they are so close to each other. But Venetian Red for the same reason as Love Letter, just because it is one of those standout shadows. It is one of those things that changed so much with the beauty industry and with the way that a lot of people use makeup, because before this palette, you didn't really see sort of more unique, brighter shades in so-called neutral palettes, and you have a lot more people who might have only worn sort of the very neutral shades wearing these, and these became kind of like the new neutral. That was sort of like a tagline you heard for a long time, the new neutral, and people were incorporating reds and pinks and oranges into their everyday eye look, whether they were being very dramatic and bold with it or just a tiny hint of the color. So I feel like I have to just be truthful with how much I love the reds there, and I wish it was easier to find more true red shadows, but I understand it's a pigmentation thing, and it can be difficult to make that kind of work. But mostly it's just like a fantasy, right? That I'd like to see other variations of red in other palettes, and seeing what other people do with more red shadows. Golden Ochre is my next shade. Golden Ochre, of course. It is a wonderful yellow shadow. It has a little hint of olive in it, but overall I feel like it is very golden. I feel like that's very appropriate. I feel like in general a lot of these shadows are very well named as well, and Golden Ochre is one of my favorite things to pair with Primavera. If I had to just quickly put two shadows on my eyes from this palette, it would be Primavera, the gold metallic, with Golden Ochre, because Golden Ochre really helps amp up Primavera, and I feel like it amplifies the golden hues in Primavera, and it makes it a little bit darker in a way, not just because Golden Ochre is a tiny bit darker of a shadow, but just because it pulls out more of those similar yellow tones from the shadow that are also in Primavera. So that's why I feel like they pair so well together. And Golden Ochre could probably have been higher on this list. It probably could have came before Venetian Red and Love Letter, but again, I was thinking overall with the usage I've made in this palette and the things that I've liked. Golden Ochre is also a shade that I probably like more now with the way that my makeup style is and how I like the more simple things, and Golden Ochre is a very simple shadow. It's not one that I really like on its own, unlike something like Raw Sienna or Burnt Orange, because I feel like just on me, something that even has that tiny bit of like that yellow olive thing just makes me look really washed out. I have to pair it with other things, and there's oftentimes people are like, I don't know how gold works because you're so cool toned, but I like making it work by pairing it with other things. And I also feel like I'm lucky because of my eye color that I can kind of pull off more of things that I maybe shouldn't. Whether or not I pull it off is totally up to your discretion, but that's my opinion anyway. My ninth favorite shadow is a red ochre. This is another reddish brown shade. I feel like it's somewhat similar to antique bronze. It's like the matte version of antique bronze. They are very similar despite the difference in the finishes, but I think that's also why they are so close together in the palette. You know, the palette was definitely very thoughtfully arranged, and I think you can look almost as like little quads, or you can look sort of like groupings of the shadows together, and to give you sort of hints on how to use them if you are really sort of stuck. You can really pair these things together very well. And so I think that it's no coincidence that you have those sort of cluster of shadows right there, because red ochre and antique bronze definitely work very well together. I will say red ochre is not a shadow I've used a lot recently, and is more of an older favorite. Things that I used a lot when I was definitely in more of a 90s grunge, wanting to rim my eyes in red, but not wanting to go like bright red, not even like a Venetian red or more pink, but wanting more of a darker reddish brown. Stuff that I remember seeing in the 90s. One of the biggest inspirations for me was my cousin, who I remember being in university in like the late 90s, and she would babysit me on stuff like that, and she just had the coolest eyeshadow, which is always warm reddish brown, and it's always stuck with me. And like whenever I come across shadows like that, I definitely go through my phases where I just love putting it all over my eye. So I feel like I need to show red ochre a little bit more love, but I just haven't been in that sort of phase lately. But it's also a really pretty shadow to just put on the outer corner a little bit. I feel like I'd like it more with other things, not just with what's in this palette. Realgar is my next shade, and when I was swatching this, I was surprised at how dark it's swatched, but it really is more of a muted orange. Despite how it looks in the pan, it really doesn't translate that well. I do remember it being a little bit more vibrant on my eye, but maybe I'm completely making that up. I don't have a whole lot of usage on this shadow, not because I don't like it, but because I never really paired it with other things that were in this palette, and I have other orange shadows I like better. There's a couple of oranges I have that are more of a stiffer formula, which I like using, even when it comes just to a matte through my crease. I like a stiffer formula than something that's too soft and going to go where I don't want it to go, which is a problem I have with a lot of these matte shadows, is they tend to just have a mind of their own and do whatever they want, and I have a lot less control. And I did use it as a blush. I actually mixed Buon Fresco and Realgar as a blush today, and Realgar is really intense, so just a warning, if you do try using this as a blush, pick up very, very little on your brush and be prepared to blend it out, because it's very intense that way, but it does look very pretty. I do think it works very well, and I did like it as my eyeshadow today, but there's just something about it that I don't love as much as other orange shadows I've come across, and something about it being a little bit more muted and having a little bit more brown in it makes it a little disappointing for me, and why it doesn't have pan like these other ones. And I'm planning on turning it into a Franken shadow because I have a wonderful idea of what to do with that one. Warm taupe is my next shadow, and it's so close to the bottom because it's just boring. It is just really a boring eyeshadow. It's exactly as the name states. It's a warm taupe. It's just not exciting. So when I was doing my ranking, it just kept moving its way down further and further down the list, because there's not a whole lot to it. It's a very simple eyeshadow. I know a lot of people like it because it's a very good transition shade for a lot of people. It's boring. There's other things that I like so much more. I don't know, I can't help it. Maybe it's also the arrangement within this palette. I'm thinking that if it was over with some of these other shades, maybe I'd use it more, but I don't like it paired with gold shadows. I find that it really just makes things sort of dirty, and I know that's a sort of a weird term, but I just feel like it dulls the gold, and I like things that amplify the golden tones, and this really just makes it really just sort of dusty and very blah, and that's nothing that I really like. But I mean, if I need to blend shadows out, a little tiny bit of it on a fluffy crease brush does the trick. That's really the only way that I use it. On a similar note, tempera. I put near the bottom because this is a shadow that I really use just all over my lid to sort of set my eyeshadow primer. I don't do that anymore. This was something that I used to do religiously when I used a lot of eyeshadow primer, and I'd have to set it so that I could blend things out, and that's how I hit pan on tempera, and I don't do that anymore. So I don't really have a whole lot of use for just a plain old beigey matte shadow. It doesn't have any sort of sheen for me, and it's a little bit too peachy for me to use as a highlight shade. I need something a little bit whiter, which is why like Vermeer works for me, but tempera doesn't work as a highlight shade. Again, I can use it sort of in the same way as warm taupe and like blend out some edges, but I often just find like a clean brush works just as well. So it's just one of those lackluster shades. Buon Fresco, I'm so sorry, it's near the bottom. This is one of most people's favorite shades, it seems. Whenever I do a video on this palette, people are always commenting on how I have no pan on this shade, how they don't understand how I don't like it, how they use it all the time. It's pretty, you know, the sort of purple mauve-y matte is pretty, but I never liked it with this palette, obviously. I never really used it very much. I don't think that it necessarily goes very well with some of these shadows here. There's other things that could have been in the place of Buon Fresco, in my opinion. Now I am coming around to it a little bit more since I used it as a blush the other day and sort of running it through the crease and then tying it in with the blush. I found that looked really nice and was a really fun way to use the shadow, and that's probably how I will continue to use it because I find it's a really unique sort of blush shade and actually blends really well that way. But as an eyeshadow with this palette, I don't like it. It's not something that I like pairing with Vermeer because, again, I feel like it just sort of dulls Vermeer instead of brightens it up. I just feel like it's sort of a dull eyeshadow for me. The way that it looks on me simply as an eyeshadow is very dull. I think if I used it with more purples, like a purple metallic, I think it would look very interesting, and I'm kind of hoping to create a purple, sort of purple bluish metallic with some of these shades. Yeah, I'm gonna try. And I think I'll like it better that way, paired with something like that, because I just don't find that it brightens up my face at all. It's just one of those boring, warm taupe-esque shades that just isn't exciting on my skin, and I don't feel like it's that flattering, when in theory it should be. In theory, Buon Fresco should be the shadow that I like the most, and maybe I'm just a contrarian. But Buon Fresco I feel like I'm going to use as a blush and not as an eyeshadow. But we'll see how things change, because I feel like my opinions of this palette have changed already within the last month. And of course, the shadow that I'm constantly complaining about, my least favorite shade, is Cyprus Number, this warm matte brown. I don't mind the shade of it at all. I actually think this is a beautiful tone for a brown. I do wish there was something a little bit darker in this palette. I feel like having Cyprus Number as the darkest shade is not great. I feel like we could benefit from something a little bit deeper in tone from this palette. I find myself wanting a little bit extra definition, and Cyprus Number is just awful. For me, I find now could also be how it has aged, that it's very streaky and very patchy, and it just sort of falls all over the place. It's not anywhere close to my favorite. It's probably like my least favorite brown. It's the shadow that I would be the least likely to grab if I needed a brown shadow. So this is definitely getting turned into something else very soon. These four down here on this side, this is what I'm planning on doing, is turning those shades into something else to start with and seeing what I can do. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this palette and just thought this would be a fun way to do it, to rank the shadows and talk about the things I like and the things I don't like. I always find that interesting, to find out what people like and what they don't like. I think that is useful information to have if you are wondering why someone's opinion on something might be so strong, or just something that they don't like, or just somebody has a differing opinion than you when it comes to makeup. And I always find it interesting. I'd love to see more people do stuff like this, talk about their favorite shadows and rank the shadows within an entire palette. I honestly don't know if this has been done before. I've talked about shadows before that I've liked in palettes. I've talked about my favorite shades in palettes. I've talked about my least favorite shades. I've done a variation of those before, but I thought this would just be something fun to do and hang out with and talk about this palette that I feel like a lot of us have. So I'd also be interested in hearing what your favorite shades are in this palette. How would you rank these shadows? If you have this palette, what are the things you reach for the most? What are the things you reach for the least? I'm very curious, and I'd like to know how you use those shades, and I'm always looking for suggestions and ideas for how to use these things, because sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle. So anyway, make sure to let me know your thoughts down below. I would really love to hear from you. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I hope we get a chance to chat soon. Bye for now.